So personally, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodians of the land on which we meet today. And on behalf of the University of Queensland and all attendees here, I'd like to pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants, including my fellow students and lecturers who continue cultural and spiritual connections to the country, and we recognize their valuable contributions to Australia and global society. So allow me to firstly welcome all of you here, my respected expert reader, Associate Professor Arif Ninan Thomas, and Associate Professor Levi Mobijoko. Thanks for being here. Our Director of HDR, Stephen, thanks for being here. And our chair for today, Dr. Bonnie Evans, and my dearest advisory team, Professor Shuang Liu, who attended this Viva Voce virtually, and Professor Nancy Pahana, thanks for being here. All of my friends and colleagues from UQ and QUT, and all of my friends who attended this Viva Voce online. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kevin Sanly Putera. I go by the name Kevin. And after 1 year of ups and downs since my commencement of this PhD study, thousands of journal articles and books, dozens of manuscripts that I have to revise and revise. At last, at this moment, I'm able to present what I'm going to do for the next 2.5 years for my PhD research, which titled Negotiating Multicultural Identities and Roles as Older Indonesian Immigrants in Australia. So 1 year ago, when I had my first discussion with Professor Shuang Liu and Nancy Pahana about this project about older immigrants with culturally and linguistically diverse or CALD backgrounds, I caught myself reflecting on this one unacademic question. How do you think your life will be when you are 65 years old and not in your home country? Even though I'm not at my 65 years old yet, this question kind of relates to me. My PhD study is actually the first time I stayed outside of Indonesia for a long time. So I must admit that some challenges back then were really challenging, especially trying to understand Australian dialects and trying to adapt with Australian weather that just hit differently here. And out of mere curiosity, I'm asking this exact question to some of my friends, including my own mother. And these are some of their responses. Must be tiring, it would be scary, and so and so. And I realized that each of us has our own way to understand aging experience as an immigrant. Nevertheless, these varied responses align with what the available literature has claimed, that this have been happening across the world, including here in Australia. And so I continue to look for more evidence and research gaps related to older immigrants' life. Under the guidance of my advisors, I've done a scoping review of communication of aged care among older immigrants. And I found that there are 3 things that emerge as the most common and complex issues being miscommunicated among families of older immigrants who age in place. The first issue is cultural and linguistic barriers. The cultural barrier refers to differences in ways of doing things. And the linguistic barrier means the inability to speak the host country's language fluently. These first issues are classical, obvious, but continuous. Now, the second issue is expectations and preferences for aged care. This is about how, if necessary, I, as an older individual, would expect any type of daily assistance from my family and friends. This includes, but it's not limited to, discussing living arrangement, end-of-life care, commuting, buying groceries, and not less important than that, who will provide those kinds of assistance. The third issue, roles and responsibilities. What is my social positioning and membership within my own family and the wider community? What type of responsibilities will I fulfill for them? The lack of communication about roles and responsibilities has been proven to result in lower psychological well-being. the term referring to feeling well and doing well. Because my advisors and I analyzed that this third theme is understudied, we agree that it's a really good idea for me to explicate this theme more for my PhD study. And what's interesting is that all of these communication challenges are related to culture, specifically to the process that scholars refer to as acculturation, the cultural change that happened within an individual because of modifications and adaptations from one culture to another. Additionally, the acculturation journey will influence the negotiation process of one's identity. For instance, if you are from Mexico and you cannot speak English well, you cannot engage in quality communication with the Australian wider community unless all of us here speak Spanish. Consequently, you are vulnerable to stress, isolation, loneliness, and lower psychological well-being. You will most likely feel inferior because you don't know who you are anymore. You don't know what your contributions to your family are, and you don't feel valuable to them. And having said that, I myself again thought, if these are the challenges that I'm going to face in my 65 years old, I think my old days will be extremely difficult as an immigrant. Getting a translator is one thing, guys, but for culture, it's not a straightforward issue. Culture itself is a complex term. Scholars and researchers even reproduce the definition of culture up to this day. So what can we do about this intertwined cultural issue? What will I do for my PhD study? So summarizing the context of this research, what we know so far is the fact that evidence has shown that older immigrants' psychological well-being is significantly related to acculturation and identity. The more successfully an individual can undergo these processes, the higher their level of psychological well-being. However, considering my finding from the scoping review that roles are important for well-being but are still understudied, we don't know how roles being put together with cultural identities are being negotiated to achieve psychological well-being as an older immigrant in Australia. And so I'd like to ascertain the relationship between identities, roles, and psychological well-being in the case of older immigrants in Australia. Therefore, for the next 2.5 years, I will investigate the negotiation of multicultural identities and roles in family among older Indonesians in Australia. I will conduct this project in the Australian context. My first reason is because Australia is rapidly aging. 50 years ago, those who aged 65 years and older were only 8% of the population. But only last year, they accounted for almost 23% of the population, a number that was predicted wouldn't happen for at least another 40 years. One of the main reasons behind the rapid growth of this cohort is migration. The latest census 4 years ago claimed that 37% of older Australians were born overseas. And in the next 30 years, half of older Australians will be almost 60% of the total population. This number is telling us that those communication challenges that I've mentioned before are culturally bound, and it will be more varied and complex. Policymakers and researchers in Australia are aware of this exponential growth. They have acknowledged that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions to cope with aged care needs and cultural preferences for older immigrants. So how the best should we approach this issue? The Australian government, Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia, or FECA, and National Aging Research Institute, or NARI, they univocally agree that understanding the aged care needs and preferences of older CALD immigrants means understanding their culture and its significance. Among hundreds of cultural groups in Australia, I decided to explicate the aging experience of older Indonesians. As of June 2022, approximately 100,000 Indonesian-born individuals reside in Australia, making it the 18th largest migrant community and the 8th country of origin with the most individuals migrating to Australia via the family visa stream. Indonesians are chosen for my study due to the multicultural identification of their people. For Indonesians, the diverse cultural identity operates on three levels. The first level, at the national level, where multicultural diversity is embodied in the national motto of Indonesia, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, diversity as one. Second, on a societal level, where multiple cultural groups share similar universal customs, traditions, beliefs. For example, we Indonesians, we always address people older than us by title like Mr. or Mrs., right? And we like bend our body a little bit when we are about to walk past them. It shows respect. And third, on an individual level, where multiculturalism is shaped by a combination of factors, including ethnicity, religion, place of upbringing, social networks, and language. Subsequently, Indonesians are expected, in my study, to exemplify a new definition of multiculturalism for acculturation literature. Because most studies presently view multiculturalism in duality between culture A and culture B, between Indonesian culture and Australian culture. However, this view has not addressed the existing intricate background of an Indonesian based on their multicultural identifiers. And based on the evidence gaps and what we expect for the future Australian elders population, I draw two significances of my research. First, as we can witness among our present society, many Australian people come from a mix of cultural backgrounds, ethnicity, and language, up to the point that one identification cannot represent their entire identity as an individual. Some of these people are living here and now among us. And second, as a consequence of the first significance, this research offers an extension of knowledge in acculturation literature, considering how intricate the cultural identity of Indonesian can be. They serve as a promising yet understudied cohort with complex cultural backgrounds in negotiating their identities and roles as immigrants. And this shall inform us about the interplay of culture, multicultural identity, roles, from the case of Indonesians, and similar approach can be taken to understand other cohort of older immigrants. And this is the visualization, a brief theoretical explanation of how I'm going to approach my study. First, there's the older immigrant on the left side, and I will include both of those who migrate at the younger age and those who migrate at later age. So we can already expect that they have different types of challenges. So that's why I decided, based on my discussion with my advisors, decided to include all of them. And as they age in Australia as Indonesians, and in the pursuit of psychological well-being, the condition when someone is doing well and feeling well, they engage in the acculturation process, exchanging intercultural interaction and values as part of their adaptations to Australian society and culture. And during this acculturation process, they negotiate their identities, which in Indonesians' cases being brought here are the multicultural identities, whereas factors like ethnicity, faith, origin, language have roles in the negotiation process. Now, what's parallel in the negotiation of roles, may it be in the context of family, community, and society. Since my study focuses on older immigrants who age in place, I'd like to put the focus on the family context. And together, this lifelong process redefines the answers to the questions of identity, who am I and who am I to them? This is where my study takes place, investigating this entire process. And based on the theoretical approach and the knowledge gaps, the overarching research question is, how do older Indonesian immigrants in Australia negotiate their multicultural identities and roles to achieve psychological well-being? And I break it down into two sub-research questions, where I will employ a mixed method approach of qualitative and quantitative to answer these questions. The first one, what are the experience of older Indonesian immigrants in Australia in negotiating their multicultural identities and roles, which is gonna be answered with face-to-face in-depth qualitative interviews with 70 males and 70 females of older Indonesians. And for the second research question, to what extent do multicultural identities as the first variable and roles as the second variable among all the Indonesian immigrants in Australia influence their psychological well-being? And this will be answered through face-to-face interview questionnaires with 100 older Indonesians. This is more details for the two studies. For the first qualitative interview studies, I'm going to employ 18 questions about migration background, cultural identification, negotiation of multicultural identities and family roles. And I'm going to analyze it using thematic analysis by NVivo software. And I will bring the first study's result to the second study to develop family roles variable. And I will employ the questionnaires with 22nd items of multis that has been developed by Yamposi et al. And 18 items of psychological well-being by Riff. Then I'm going to analyze the data using SPSS software. And thanks to UQ, LinkedIn Learning, and Queensland Cyber Infrastructure Foundation, these are the trainings that I have attended the past year, and I believe will be useful for my research. And I have to admit that the quantitative part has been no walk in the park. It's really difficult, guys. So yeah, and I expect my project can be published in reputable journals and conferences. For the scoping review, I decided to revisit it and reformulate it into systematic review of qualitative studies. And I already got the Prospero registration, so we're good to go to write it down. And for the first finding for my first study, I aim to attend this joint conference by IAIR and IACCP next year at Brisbane. And for the second study, I'm planning to submit it to one of these journals by APA. These are only the main ideas, but still I'm flexible and open to another idea of publications, but these are my main ideas for now. And this is the timeline that I'm trying to stick with. Thankfully, my ethics application was granted 2 weeks ago, so I'm good to go. I expect to present one study for each next progress review, and I have to conclude everything no later than the first research quarter of 2027. So, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude my Viva Voce, I'm turning back to the question that I asked myself back then. How do you think your life will be when you are 65 years old and not in your home country? In my capacity as a researcher, I cannot answer this question, at least until I'm hearing more from my participants. Until then, for all of us here, let's change this question to, what can I reflect on regarding older immigrants who live around me? And in my capacity as a student, I found something that I believe can serve as an answer and insight for us to bring home after this. Citing Professor Brian Nidau, ex-director of NARI, aging well is not just about having good mental and physical health. It is about recognizing the contribution of older people within their own communities, whether as leaders, as educators, and as carers. May this Viva Voce help us to be mindful of older people around us and our old days in the future. Thank you so much, guys.
How
many minutes?
And 1.5 minutes left, so right on time. There you go. Alrighty, so I'm just going to make it so that people in the, maybe I'll show the participants, like, so at least we can see if people are talking. I'm going to let online participants unmute themselves if they have a question to ask. But in the first instance, I'll ask if there are any questions from the room.
Yes.
Does anyone have a question for Kevin to pick up the discussion today?
Kevin, congratulations.
Thank you, Stephen.
My question, I guess, I think you anticipated it in your final slide. I guess the answer is it's too soon to know. But my question was what you think the argument that you're going to be mounting as a result of the answers to the questions are, what your you beautifully expressed the scope and the rationale of your project. Is it just too soon to get a sense of what your argument, your central argument will be?
Mhm. So am I answering this now?
Answer your question.
So the argument for my research is placed within the idea that it's not that simple to understand an older immigrants as an individual because of their cultural identities. And based on the literature evidence I have read before, even in the most popular framework of acculturation literature of John Barry, on which he engaged that to understand an older immigrant, we have to understand the previous culture before migration and after migration. So, as I said before, between Indonesian culture and Australian culture. However, I don't think this framework will be suitable to understand enough and exemplified in my study the case of Indonesians, because Indonesians have their own complexities in identities. And I'm trying to say that if you want really to understand what the older immigrants want for their aging, I suppose we have to go back to them. I suppose we have to listen more to them. And especially because cultural identities are being influenced the most from the acculturation, we have to understand their culture first. We have to understand what is categorized as a culture for Indonesians. And as in my argument, were religion, place of upbringing, language, social networks, ethnicity. So yeah, where most studies think that any ethnicity would be adequate to address one's identity, my argument, no, it's not.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Questions for Kevin?
All right.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much for your presentations, Kevin. It's really wonderful to know and to understand about the idea. I'm thinking about what I'm going to do in my if I'm in the age of
65 years old. Yeah.
I'm also consider about things. The things that I would like to ask a little bit more about the details related to how you prepare to recruit your participants.
Yes.
The idea that you mentioned, you wrote in your presentation, you could directly connect with 17
Males and 17 females.
males and females. How you define the numbers of the participants and how you start communicate with them, the initial connections with them. Is there any plan or things? I would like to hear more about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So for the first study of the interview study, I will employ like two methods of sampling. The first one is purposive sampling, and the second one is snowball sampling. So for the purposive sampling, I will firstly engage in online communities of Indonesians in Southeast Queensland, where I will post this advertising online so they can reach me out if they're interested, or if they know somebody who would be eligible for the study and they would refer them to me. Because firstly, based on my research on Facebook, we have at least 7,000 members of Indonesian communities in Brisbane called Komunitas Indonesia di Brisbane, KIB, and the second communities of Indonesians in Australia with 5,000 members. I believe that's more than enough as a start. And why did I decide to go with 17 males and 17 females? Because there's this research that by Henning and Kaiser on 2022, that I will reach the data saturation, where the data will be considered as enough between 9 and 17 interviews. So I'm just playing it safe by using the most numbers, which is 17, to get the data saturation, even though the data is not saturated enough later on when I have 17 interviews already. There's this guideline by Henning and Kaiser. I will add 1/3 samples more repetitively until I reach data saturation.
I also would like to address a little bit more because you are concerning about Queensland's area, state of Queensland. Do you think you were going to, recruit from another state, like
States.
Victoria's or Adelaide or other states?
Yeah, I have to admit that initially that was the idea, but because of manpower and budget constraints, my advisor suggested me just to focus on Southeast Queensland first. And God so help me, if I get to be a professor one day, I think I'm gonna employ this project in a bigger scale.
Yeah.
But for now, for my PhD, I think Southeast Queensland might do it.
And so everyone comes to Queensland to become old anyway.
Exactly. Exactly. Stephen has already claimed it already. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We've got time for probably one more question. I want to particularly invite anyone online. We have quite a few people online. Yes, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Kevin. How are you?
Hi, Professor. How are you? I'm doing great. Thank you. It's a
Yeah.
friend of mine.
I really enjoy your presentation, so thank you so much. I want to continue the question about the sampling that will be taking. Do
Yeah.
you think how you plan the characteristic or the profiles of your sample? For example, are you going to focus on the married couple or a single older people, or maybe their background, why they are moving to Australia, etc.? Do you think that will be impacting on your study?
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor, for the question. I have actually written it down, explained it down, the sampling requirements, the prerequisites for my participants. So the first one, they have to be at least on 65 years old, because these are the age that consider as older immigrants in Australia, older people in Australia, rather than 55 years old with what we have in Indonesia, so 10 years older here. And the second, they have to age in place, not in nursing home, because aging in place, that's where the cultural interactions with the family happens the most, rather than nursing home. And the third requirements, they have to at least have migrated to Australia at least for 5 years, because that's considered they have already enough experience in acculturating to Australian culture. And they have to be able to give consent on behalf of their own. I don't want their family members to give consent for me to interview them. I want them to voluntarily participate in the study. I hope that answers it, Professor.
Married, single?
I'm open to both.
It means when you ask the husband, you will also ask the wife, right?
Not necessarily, but as long as they both want to participate, I don't mind.
All right. Thank you so much. Good luck.
Thank you, Professor.